Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. This is our second of two virtual training sessions for the 2023 Congressional Visits Day. I'm Russ Harrison, Managing Director of IEEE-USA, and I will be leading the training today. As always, if you have questions, concerns, comments, anything I say is confusing, please put it into the comment section, and I'll rotate back to the comments at the end of my talk. So this is our messaging training session where we're going to talk about what we're going to talk about at the Congressional Visits Day. And there's always a trade-off for this particular training. We want to give you the information on our messages as soon as possible, so you have as much time as we can give you to prepare, to think about what you want to say, to think about what's important, and to find those all-important local stories about how these issues impact your local community. But at the same time, we're trying to tell you what's going on Capitol Hill, and the people on Capitol Hill keep doing stuff. And so it's kind of a moving target. And so as a result, I'm going to give you the best information we have. We don't have all of the details put together just yet, although we have enough to get you started. Over the next couple days, I'm going to be sending you briefing sheets with more details on a lot of the issue areas. But for now, this will get us started. As I said, today is the messaging and messages portion of our training. Last time we talked about how to get around, what your meeting is going to look like, what to expect. Today, we're just going to talk about what do you say in your meeting? What do we want to focus on? Before we get to that, though, we need to be quite clear. These are your meetings. They're not my meetings. They're not IEEE meetings. They're your meetings. You got this meeting with your legislator because you are a voter, and that's the best reason of all to have a meeting. IEEE-USA has told your legislative offices what issues we think you're going to talk about. We have to do that to get the meeting, and the legislator wants to know which staffer needs to be in the room. You know, if you're going to come in and talk about education, they need the education staffer. If you're going to come in and talk about the budget, as we're going to do, they need the budget staffer. However, and I'm going to go over those issues that we told them about as a suggestion of what we hope you'll be willing to talk about in your meeting. But IEEE-USA is not in the business of telling IEEE members what to say, what to think, or what to support. We are in the business of helping you say and support whatever it is that you want to support. So when you go to Capitol Hill, you are not going as a representative of IEEE, as a representative of IEEE-USA, or a representative of your company or university, unless you want to be. You are just going as you, a regular old voter who has something to say. And that makes you persuasive and powerful on Capitol Hill. So, that is an introduction. What are you going to do in your session with your legislator? Most importantly, these meetings are not lectures. The goal of the meeting is not to have legislative offices understand you, understand our issues, or understand our professions. It'd be nice if that happens, but that's not actually the goal. The problem is you have very little time, 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, that's about it, to discuss some fairly complicated policy questions. And if you try to explain the issue to the staff, you're going to run out of time. Instead, you need to think of these meetings as sales pitches. All you care about is whether they buy the product. You don't care why, you don't care if they understand the product. You just need to say enough to get them to buy it, which in this case is to agree with us. And it is true that it's easier to get staff to agree with us if they understand us, but it's not actually necessary. And understanding is going to take a lot more time than you have, which is why this is just the first of many meetings, not the end of the project. But when you go in, you're going to deliver 3 precise messages. You're going to say what you want clearly, upfront. Congressman, staff, I want you to do this. I want you to support these programs, oppose these programs, do this, do that. You're going to say quickly why you want it. This is not a comprehensive analysis of the issue with all the data explained. It's just, I want you to invest in this because it's good for my business, it's good for the country, it'll, whatever the explanation is, but very short and very direct. And then you're going to say why this thing that you're talking about is good for your local community. And as we talked about last time, that is the single most important argument you can make for whatever it is you're arguing for. Engineers and other STEM professionals deal with data in their daily lives. You want the big picture. You want all the information. You want as much input as you can get to a problem before reaching the conclusion. That's not how politics works. In politics, a well-developed anecdote about how a given issue impacts the local voters, the local community, is actually more important than the national data. And so part of your assignment from between now and next Wednesday is to try to think of those little stories, those little examples, those little data points that are unique to your community that will make the issue real to the legislator that is really only focused on your local community, district, and state. And if you can do that, if you can make the big argument very quickly and then deliver those one or two nifty concrete examples from your local community, you will be incredibly successful at our CVD. Although, to be honest, you're going to be fairly successful either way. But that's how you take a good meeting and make it a great meeting. So I've been telling you for a couple months now that we have 4 things we're going to talk about. Over the weekend, as I was preparing for this particular session, it occurred to me that we really only have 3, and then the 4th is just a subset of one of them. So we're going to focus on 3 things today, and I'm going to explain the difference as we get into it. First is keeping Congress's CHIPS Act commitments. They made some promises in last year's CHIPS Act, and now they have to fulfill them. We're going to express our support for nuclear energy and fusion research. And we're going to ask Congress to move cautiously on open access. We'll go through these one at a time. First of all, the CHIPS and Science Act, which we will refer to as just the CHIPS Act from now on. This is the major piece of legislation that passed the middle of last year. It includes $57 billion to induce companies to bring chip manufacturing back into the United States. And that is not what we're going to talk about. The reason we're not going to talk about it is because it's done. They passed it, they appropriated and authorized the money. It's done. The money's going to get spent. That program is going to be a success. So Congress has nothing to do about it. They've finished. We're going to talk about the other parts of the CHIPS Act, specifically programs to broaden the workforce, both geographically and educationally. That is, we want to pull Americans into the STEM economy all across the country, not just the big tech hubs. And we want all Americans included. We want, PhD researchers, absolutely. But we also want people with undergraduate degrees, with associate's degrees that have gone through apprenticeships, and all the other versions of education and training in between. We want Congress to pay for and to appropriate money for the tech research programs in the CHIPS Act and to invest in the tech transfer infrastructure that is in the CHIPS Act. I'm going to go through that in a little more detail in a second. The thing is, Congress paid the $57 billion for chips manufacturing. They paid it, they authorized it, they appropriated it, and they appropriated it across many years. So that's finished. Every other program in the CHIPS Act has to be appropriated every single year because Congress only does the budget usually 1 year at a time. That's normal for almost all programs across the federal government. We'll talk about that in a minute. And we need to do it again. And we're going to have to come back in 2024 and 25 and 26 to make sure these programs are funded. Beyond that, though, the CHIPS Act makes some very big promises for federal spending and research in programs to increase innovation. They didn't fund it all. Now, and honestly, they're not going to fund all of it, but they didn't fund as much of it as we expected. And so not only do we want them to maintain the spending that went into effect last year, but we want them to increase it to get closer to the goals set in the CHIPS Act itself. Now, let's pause a second and talk about the difference between an authorization and an appropriation. In order for a federal agency to spend money, they need 2 things. They need Congress to authorize the spending, and they also need Congress to appropriate money for the spending. The CHIPS Act, the $57 billion for chips manufacturing is actually both an authorization and an appropriations bill, which is very unusual. Congress almost never does that. Everything else, it was just an authorization bill. Authorization is permission to spend money. It is the legal justification that a program has to exist. The federal government can't do anything unless Congress passes a law saying it can do stuff. And that's what an authorization bill is. It creates a new program to do X, which is good. Think of yourself as a 12-year-old, and you want to go to the movies with your friends. First thing you got to do is you got to ask your mom for permission. And mom has to say, yes, you go to the movies. But that is not sufficient. You also need an appropriation. Appropriation is the allocation of specific government money to a program. In other words, an authorization is permission to spend money. The appropriation is the actual money. So to go back to our metaphor, you've asked mom for permission to go to the movies. Now you have to ask dad for $20 to buy your ticket, which is harder. In Congress, authorizations and appropriations are handled by two different committees, two different sets of legislators. So there's not really any connection between the two. When Congress authorizes a program, they authorize a budget level. They say this program is going to be allowed to exist to accomplish these policy aims, and they can spend up to $100 bajillion. That number is always set really high. It's set high for two reasons. First of all, you can't appropriate beyond it. So once you set the authorization level, you can only appropriate up to that level. Now you can change the authorization level with another law, but you want to set the ceiling really high so you don't have to do that. Secondly, when a legislator goes on the campaign trail, they can say, I passed a bill that would authorize $100 bajillion for this program, knowing full well that that's not how much money it got. But you did, since most people don't understand the difference between authorizing and appropriating. For political purposes, it doesn't matter. The CHIPS Act, the authorization levels were set really, really high. To be blunt, they were set ridiculously high in a few areas, and there's no chance at all that we'll get up to those levels. But that's normal. And the appropriation was not nearly what we'd hoped in a number of areas. Appropriators, unlike authorizers, have to think about the federal budget. They have to think about the deficit. They have to think about borrowing. They have to balance various programs against each other to set levels that we can actually afford or, come close to affording. So appropriations tends to be set much lower than authorization, which is exactly what happened in CHIPS. Authorization, typically it's 3 to 5 years, and in the actual law, it will say this program is authorized for X number of years, and then they have to redo it. And most programs are sunsetted after a number of years unless they're reauthorized. It forces Congress to take a look at the program and make sure it's still needed. Appropriations almost always have to be done every year in their entirety. So every year, Congress has to pass an appropriations bill. They have to pass the federal budget, which is appropriations. And if they don't, the programs don't have any money, which means even if Congress did fund our programs to a nice level in 2022 for the 2023 fiscal year, we still have to ask them to do it again every single year because appropriations usually only last for 1 year. Now, the $57 billion for chips manufacturing is appropriated through 5 years, so that's done for a while, but everything else is not. So what do I mean by everything else? Well, first and foremost, I mean TIP. TIP is a new directorate within the National Science Foundation. TIP stands for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. And it is a very unique piece of the National Science Foundation. The NSF is one of the major research institutions within the federal government, and it typically focuses on speculative, kind of academic research across all of the fields. There's a bunch of different directorates, each one focusing on a different kind of department within a university. But NSF is supposed to do the speculative stuff, the theoretical stuff. TIPS isn't. TIPS was specifically created to do the research that is most likely to have an impact on society quickly. And in particular, the TIPS Act the TIPS Directorate was defined in CHIPS as focusing on 10 specific research areas, which are up there on your screen. And if you look at those 10 areas, you will quickly notice that they are all almost entirely IEEE areas. Natural disaster prevention is really climate change, but there's tech in there. And the bio and medical research, medical technology research, that's a lot of health research and technology. Material science is physics, but it's also a lot of engineering, and everything else is just engineering. And so most of the research TIP is going to be investing in is going to be research done by IEEE members. Or the other thing TIP does that is very unique for NSF is it is tasked with creating government programs to pull great ideas out of academia and push them into the private sector. Their job is tech transfer, to find better ways to do tech transfer broadly across the entire country, which is fantastic. Here's the problem. The way the NSF typically works is Congress doesn't fund each one of the directorates. Congress funds the NSF, gives the NSF a big blob of money, and then the NSF director decides how to allocate it between all the directorates. We want to ask Congress to create a special budget line item just for TIP. We want to do that for a couple of reasons. First of all, the one we want to say is because this is research designed to interact with the private sector needs more certainty about the stability of these budgets over time to allow tech transfer and the tech innovation pipeline to be as robust as it possibly can be. The second reason we want a specific line item for TIPS is something we don't want to say on Capitol Hill, which is by giving it its own line item, it's easier to defend. Because NSF is funded as a block by Congress, in order to fight for more spending or more funding for our particular pieces of it, we have to argue for the entire agency, which we do. We, in fact, IEEE-USA has said, and we will continue to say, that all of the areas of research are important because you never know where great innovation is going to come from. But in a difficult budget environment, which is what we're in now, it will be politically helpful if we can focus specifically on our areas of research to say, this research is particularly important. The unfortunate reality is that research is a very easy thing for politicians to cut out of the budget. The reason is there's two reasons. One, most of the public doesn't know about it. More importantly, if Congress were to completely eliminate all federally funded research, there wouldn't be really any negative consequences for the country in the first year because research is long term. Now, there would be devastating consequences for the country in 15 years, but most members of Congress won't be members of Congress in 15 years, so that's not a persuasive argument. Given that we are going to be entering a period of time for at least the next 2 years where large budget increases are going to be hard to find and some budgets will get cut, we want to create political defense for our primary budgets within the National Science Foundation. And one way to do that is to take TIP and make it its own budget line in the congressional budget. Now, this was called for in the CHIPS Act, but it didn't happen last year in the actual budget. Again, authorizers wrote CHIPS, appropriators wrote the budget, not on the same page, which is normal. The TIP did get a budget of $450 million from the NSF last year, which is quite good. But we would like to see that number go up. But first and foremost, we want it to have its own budget line. And getting the budget line is actually more important than getting the budget increase in the short run, though we want to ask for both. Other pieces of the CHIPS Act that we want to support, the innovation infrastructure. We are, IEEE-USA, actually, we were one of the groups that originally fought for this, and one of the groups that helps make this happen in the CHIPS Act. Broad workforce training programs. We think that it is important that the United States have a very large STEM workforce. And that STEM workforce has to include people from everywhere and people at all levels of education. We need people to build the very sophisticated robots and spaceships and other cool stuff that you guys all do. But we also need just people who know how to build a clean room. And we need people who know how to fix a robot, which don't necessarily need a college degree. CHIPS is very good about saying we need to invest in all those types of people. And we need to invest in Americans in parts of the country that don't do a lot of innovating, particularly rural America. And CHIPS does that as well, and we think those programs are worth protecting. Additionally, there are a number of government programs created by TIPS that facilitate tech transfer, that are trying to build connections between academia and the private sector. We think those programs need to be continued and needed to be invested in. Specifically, the I-Corps, EPSCoR, and regional innovation engines, all the TIPS, we think are particularly important for budgets in the 2024 fiscal year budget. So here are some of IEEE-USA's budget requests. And here's why I decided not to make this a standalone ask in our fly-in. And again, your meetings, you can handle this the way you want. The problem is this, though. For IEEE-USA to talk about the fiscal year budget, there are dozens and dozens of different government programs that IEEE members care about. And so these meetings, these budget meetings, can easily just be a laundry list of programs, which is not terribly helpful. Now, if you want to pick one or two of these that you think is uniquely important and say, hey, you know what, congressmen, staffers to congressmen, you need to really invest in NASA because NASA is awesome and it's important to our district and it's important to my company. This is why. That's fine. But if you try to talk about all the programs, it's just going to be a laundry list. And the staff, frankly, you're probably going to have to read it from a list, and the staff it'll just sound like you're doing what you're told. And what you really want to do in these meetings is sound sincere, sound like these are issues you really care about. The best way to do that, by the way, is to actually care about the things you talk about. But it's hard to do that with a long list of programs. But I wanted to put this up here to let you see what the numbers are like, and also to talk about, well, the budgets, and particularly the president's budget request. Let's go through them very quickly. We supported a National Science Foundation budget of $11.9 billion, $1.2 billion for TIP. You'll note, by the way, that the current budget for TIP is $250 million, which is basically a third of what we're asking for in TIP. There's a reason for that, and I'll come back to it in a second. $300 million for the regional innovation engines, NASA $27.2 billion, NIST, National Institute of Standards Technology, at $1.46 billion, including and emphasizing increased investments in facilities. Those are the actual research facilities, some of which are embarrassingly obsolete at NIST. Department of Energy, $52 billion, their Office of Science, particularly interested in fusion energy, which we're going to come back to, and we're asking for $1 billion in fusion energy research. And then there's the Department of Defense. Last year, we got really, really nice increases in almost all of our budgets. Some cases, we got extraordinarily good increases in our budget. The exception to that rule was the Defense Department research budget. That's budget line 61, 62, and 63. Those refer to the basic research programs at the DoD. These programs are always under at least a little bit of stress. The reason is Democrats generally want to do basic research somewhere other than the Defense Department, and Republicans generally want to develop weapons systems, not conduct long-term research at the Defense Department. And so these programs get pulled. And so IEEE-USA tries to make sure Congress doesn't let that happen. And, usually we're reasonably successful. Now, all the numbers on this slide come from President Biden's budget request. Every year, the president submits a budget to Congress saying, this is what I want. And every year, it's basically ignored, which it will be this year, too. As I noted with TIPS, a lot of these numbers are just ridiculously big. The TIP budget is not going to be increased 300%. And frankly, I don't think TIP could absorb the money if they got it. So they're going to get much less than what the president requested, and President Biden knows that. His budget was really the opening bid in a negotiation with House Republicans. House Republicans are really pushing to keep spending low. President wanted to push it really high, knowing that they'd end up in the middle someplace, which is another reason not to obsess about these budget numbers. We want to support President Biden because he's fighting for programs that we want. But we also don't want to appear unreasonable when we sit down with congressional Republicans who are interested in fighting the deficit. And we don't want to, fall on our sword over budget numbers that we know aren't real. So for your meetings, talking about programs you think should be invested in, programs you think are important, programs you think that Congress needs to support is fantastic. Getting into specific budget numbers is tricky though. And so unless it's a program that you feel passionately about and you really want to talk about the budget numbers, I would even be reluctant to mention what the president has asked for, unless it's a Democratic office, in which case they might want to hear it. So let's move on to nuclear and fusion energy. I keep calling it fission. It's not, it's fusion. We might have a window here. Policy windows is a concept people with policy backgrounds like myself talk about. There are ideas out there in society, in the policy world, that can kick around for years and years and years and years and years. And all of a sudden, for various reasons, they pop to the top, and you have a little window of time in which you can actually get that done. And if you miss it, it goes away for a long time. For example, IEEE-USA and a bunch of other people had worked very closely with the Obama administration to create a package of incentives for American companies to invest in nuclear energy. There were guaranteed loans and grants and all sorts of other regulatory things that President Obama had signed off on, and they'd actually scheduled the day it was going to be announced. And 10 days before the president announced it, Fukushima happened, and a nuclear reactor melted down in front of the entire world. Boom, our window closed, and it is just now reopening again. We want to take advantage of this window this time. Last year, Congress passed two pieces of legislation, the Infrastructure Investment Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, both of which contain sizable sections supporting domestic nuclear energy. But nobody talked about it. In the press releases from various legislators bragging about this bill, nuclear energy was barely mentioned, if at all. What's going on here is Congress is starting to recognize that nuclear energy needs to play a central role in our electrical grid, but they think the public doesn't support it. And so they want to do it without getting noticed. The most important thing you could say on nuclear energy in your meetings is IEEE and you, the engineer, think nuclear energy is a safe, reliable source of energy that this country needs more of. And we support Congress's efforts to incentivize civilian nuclear reactors in the United States. The details on how to do that are secondary. Just expressing your support to let legislators know they have public support is the most important thing you can do. Having said that, you're about to get a leave behind, hopefully tomorrow, that asks for a couple specific reforms that Congress can do to help the nuclear energy industry in the United States. First of all, define nuclear energy as a renewable energy source. Now, I know technically it's not, but it's very close. And for legal reasons, defining it as renewable energy will make it easier to build new nuclear reactors and open up a bunch of federal incentives to help companies do that. So it's a fairly easy legal tweak that will have very big impacts and very big benefits to the industry. We want Congress to make it easier to relicense existing nuclear power plants, assuming they've been upgraded, they have new safety features put in, and they've been properly maintained. I mean, you got to check all these things. But if the reactor's in good shape, there's no reason to shut it down just because it's reaching some arbitrary date. With proper maintenance and proper upgrades, a lot of these nuclear reactors can continue to operate for quite a long time, safely. And that's a lot cheaper than building a new reactor. Lastly, we want increased funding for nuclear R&D, particularly some of the new nuclear reactor designs that are starting to come online and starting to be developed. Nuclear reactors that are smaller, that are safer, that are more reliable, and produce less waste, all good for the industry, good for the country. But again, all these details are nice, but the real message is we are engineers, you are an engineer, and we think this is safe, reliable, and clean energy, and you, Congress, should support it. Fission, which I understand is not quite the same thing as nuclear, because my colleague Aline keeps pointing that out to me. But there was a major breakthrough in fusion technology at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in December. Fusion for those of you who don't know, has the potential to be the answer. If we can figure out how to build reliable, stable fusion reactors, that in theory could provide us with almost unlimited amounts of clean energy. The only problem is we don't know how to do it. And for a long time, we were 10 years away from developing a working fusion reactor. And we've been about 10 years away from fusion for about 60 years now. Well, the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory got ignition. They got a fusion reaction started, passing a major a milestone in the development of real fusion energy reactors. Long way to go, but we're closer than we were a couple months ago. The president has put $1 billion to do fusion energy research into his budget. We support that. And that's one budget line that you can explicitly support, because this is a fairly small program. And frankly, it has massive potential if we can figure out how to do it. Okay, let's move to open access. Open access is hard. It is a hard issue to understand. It is a hard issue to explain. And if you don't feel you can do it, don't. But it is also an issue that is uniquely important to IEEE's financial health. The issue itself is complicated. It is obscure. Nobody understands it on the Hill, and the public doesn't care at all. So there are no votes in it, which makes this a hard pitch. On the other hand, if we get open access wrong, we could do some real harm to America's innovation infrastructure, do some real harm to academia, and do some real harm to nonprofits like IEEE that subsidize our work with the public, our contributions to society. We subsidize that through our publications business, which is under assault. Your goal on this issue is just to say, I am worried about this, you should be too. This is one of those issues that if Congress hears from a relatively few number of people that this is a problem, they will start focusing on it, and that's 90% of the way to our goal. So what is it? The idea behind open access, it's a philosophy for how to handle research that is funded with federal money. The idea being that any research the taxpayer pays for should be available to the taxpayer free of charge. In the Obama administration, there was a negotiation between publishers, including IEEE-USA, IEEE, and open access advocates. And we reached an agreement to say all federally funded research would be made publicly available a year after publication. So publishers had 1 year to make money off these ideas, to pay for the cost of publishing, and then it would be free for everybody. And we thought it worked. However, within the open access space, there are a bunch of questions. If we're going to make materials publicly available, who pays for the price, who pays the cost of producing the articles? Now, that can be done, as I mentioned, through subscriptions to journals, unless the articles are being made available immediately, in which case that becomes harder. The researchers can pay to have their articles published. Federal grant money, when you get a grant to do the research that's causing the whole problem here, you can take a piece of that to pay to have your results published. Some people have suggested that the publisher should pay. That's not actually going to happen because we don't have the money for it. So what happened here is we had this agreement for the 1 year grace period that's been in effect for more than a decade. Just before Labor Day last year, OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, issued guidance ordering federal agencies to come up with plans to make all federally funded research available the minute it is published. Those plans have to be put in place by 2025, so we got some time here. But right now, all of the agencies that do research are working on their plans. A few of them have released them. Now, there's some problems here. Some of these just really irritate me. The first thing is OSTP didn't talk to us first. Now, they don't technically have to do that, but we actually had meetings with OSTP in the months leading up to the issuing of the guidance just before Labor Day. At those meetings, we were actually told by OSTP that nothing was in the works, nothing was going to change, so there was no need to talk about open access. So we didn't. We left it off the agenda. OSTP then told Congress that they had consulted with publishers before issuing their guidance, and they cited the meetings where they told us not to talk about open access as examples of where we talked about open access, which is really, really underhanded. And frankly, 26 years in Washington, I've never seen a federal agency act like that. Just irritates me. Interestingly, OSTP also didn't consult with Congress. Congress didn't see it coming. Most of the federal agencies didn't see it coming. They just sort of did it, which is not how these things are supposed to be done. Specifically, interestingly, Congress had asked OSTP to come up with specific budget numbers for these programs before changing the rules, which OSTP did not do. To this day, OSTP has not figured out how much instant open access is going to cost, nor do they have a plan for paying for it. Oddly, OSTP at one point actually suggested that moving to immediate open access would cost nothing, which is not true. We think that little piece of information is kind of important. Additionally, OSTP has not put any of these rules through public comment, and we really think that they should be. In order for the federal government to change regulations, they have to go through the public comment period. There are exceptions to that rule, but that is usually the case. OSTP is now taking the position that because this is not a major rule change, they don't have to do that. It does seem like a major rule change to us. Now, you don't necessarily want to bring all of this up with Congress. I just wanted to let you know why what's happening is happening. But we do want to raise the issue. In particular, we want to talk about conferences. It's one thing to release a journal article for public consumption as soon as it is published. But there is a footnote in the OSTP guidance that says agencies might want to also include conferences and conference proceedings in their open access rules. Now, since then, OSTP has backed off that requirement. But the early rules, a couple of the agencies have released their rules, their preliminary rules already. Those agencies have included conferences. Some of those are okay. NASA in particular has a good rule in this regard. NASA's rule says if a NASA employee is going to speak at a conference, and for that talk, they produce PowerPoint slides or any other sort of thing to present at the conference, those things have to be made available to the public, which seems fine to me. They have to be made available by NASA, not by us, or whoever's running the conference. But yeah, if a federal employee creates a PowerPoint slide to present to a private group, the PowerPoint slide should be public, and NASA should publish it. That's fine. The problem is, it is possible that the federal agencies, and our understanding is some of the federal agencies are thinking about doing this, to decree that if any of their workers go to a conference, all of the proceedings for that conference have to be made publicly available right after the conference. There are a bunch of problems with that. The most important is it's difficult to reconcile that requirement with the IP rights of the conference organizers, and other presenters at the conference. There are logistical, practical problems. Conference proceedings are generally not available right after a conference and sometimes aren't produced for months later. And in fact, for some conferences, they're not produced at all. Additionally, the point of having a journal is the article. The point of having a conference is actually not the proceeding. The point of the conference is the conference, and the proceedings underwrite the success of the conference. In other words, the real benefit of the conference is the dialogue and the networking. And the proceedings are a nice benefit, but they're not the point. And the existence of the proceedings helps pay for the other good stuff that come from the proceedings. If conference proceedings have to be made publicly available, the conference model itself starts to weaken and comes into question. Plus, IEEE frankly isn't sure how to do it. What we are asking Congress is simply that the status quo on conferences be maintained, that they be left out of any open access requirements until further discussions can be had. So we're asking Congress, IEEE-USA is currently asking Congress, and we ask you to consider asking Congress as well, to take a look at the OSTP rules, to consider what OSTP did, and to possibly ask them to delay it until certain questions are answered, like who's going to pay for this. Part of that request is a proper cost-benefit analysis. If OSTP is going to move these rules, before they do so, they should figure out how much it's going to cost and how those costs are going to be paid. And so far, they haven't done that, and that's really, it's fallen down on the job. We would suggest that Congress delay any open access rules until these basic questions can be answered. And most importantly, Congress should insist that the status quo on conferences and conference proceedings be maintained. So those are our big issue asks. Those are our big areas. Again, the most important thing for you to do in your meetings is not to go over the policy side of things, to talk about the ins and outs of open access, except perhaps how they impact your local area, or to go into the details of the budget. I can do that. My colleagues at IEEE-USA can do that. Frankly, that's why you have staff in Washington, is to go through all the details. Your job is to take these issues and say, this is what I'm worried about, and this is why. And again, those little local stories, the connection to your local community is more important than anything I could ever say to the legislators. On open access, for example, does IEEE do conferences in your district? IEEE holds conferences in every one of the 50 states every year, and Puerto Rico and some of the other territories. So there are conferences in your state. There are probably conferences in your congressional district, although not necessarily. But there are conferences nearby. If you're involved in one of them, say, hey, Congressman, I help run, I attend, I've organized, whatever it is you do, this conference on this technology, and we held it in this town in your district. They will probably have no idea about that. And so that information alone is valuable to your legislator. And I'm concerned about these open access rules. I'm very concerned about rules to include conference proceedings in open access. And I would really like it if you could ask the government or tell the government to exempt conferences from the open access laws, maintain the rules that are in place now until we can have a better conversation about what the rules should be. Link it. I'll tell you specifically, we've been up on Capitol Hill. My colleague, James Savage in particular, has been talking to legislative offices about open access. And he's gotten some good traction with some legislators who had no idea this was even an issue by saying, let me talk about all the conferences that IEEE has in your district. Let me talk about how much money these conferences bring into your district, how many people they employ, how much they help small businesses in your district. Are you aware that OSTP is jeopardizing that? We think you should take a closer look at these rules before they go into effect. And that's incredibly powerful. You know the conference business better than I do, better than IEEE-USA staff does. And conveying those stories to legislators is the best way to get their attention. And since you only have a few minutes, 10 minutes, maybe 7 to 10 minutes to have these conversations, getting to the point, telling the story quickly that gets their attention is the best way to communicate your concerns. Notes on our notes. You are going to be receiving a series of documents from me over the next week as we get them finalized. Some of these documents will go into a leave behind. This is a folder, a physical folder that you will get at our training next Tuesday that you will hand to one of these folders in every meeting you have to the legislators. They'll have information on IEEE-USA, a one-page summary of our messages, and fact sheets on our various issues. You will receive a couple additional pieces of information from me electronically, just providing you with more details. Excuse me. This will include the cheat sheet that I sent out to you last week. Those won't be given to legislators. They're not secret or anything. They're just more information than they need. to help you prepare for your meetings. The leave behinds will go, as I said, to the staff. The other sheets will just be available to you. And all of this material will be in your Soapbox digital tool that you will be receiving shortly. Specifically, the digital tool will be sent to you, access to the tool will be sent to you on Wednesday. You will get an email from Nick Ronish, at Soapbox. There's the email address. When you get that email address, it is very important that you open up the digital tool, only for a second or two if you don't have time. But to access the tool, make sure it works, make sure the login works. And by logging in, you will tell Soapbox and IEEE-USA that you're ready for the CVD, you are in fact coming, and you have what you need. So please keep an eye out for that digital tool and open it promptly. April 4th, next Tuesday, we will have our 1 o'clock training session starting at the National Press Club. A little more information on that. We'll be meeting at 1 o'clock. I'll go through quickly the procedures for your Hill visits, touch on the asks again, not in as much detail as today, but going over them very quickly, highlighting anything that's changed in the past week. Stuff is always happening in Washington. There'll be new information probably before you get here. You will then have an opportunity to break up into your teams, the people you'll be going with all day to all of your meetings, to talk about what you want to talk about, the issues, things you want to highlight, the stories you want to tell, who's going to be kind of the captain for each meeting, be in charge of each meeting, and who's going to say what, and basically get yourself organized. We'll serve dinner at 5 o'clock. Will be pizza and a few other things, nothing terribly fancy, but a little bit of food for you. We'll be done by 6:30. And then you're free to do whatever you want. April 5th, you'll be on Capitol Hill all day. There will be no meeting of the IEEE participants on April 5th because somebody is going to have a meeting from 8:30 in the morning till 5 o'clock at night, although most of you will have your meetings in the morning. And so there's no real time for us to get together. Some of you have flights at 6:30. I think a few of you have flights a little earlier than that. So you're going to have to leave the Hill immediately in the evening, and I don't want to have a meeting at 6 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock in the morning when some of you don't have your meetings till noon. And you can spend the morning at one of the Smithsonian's if you want, which I recommend. So the 5th, you'll be on your own. IEEE-USA staff will be on the Hill all day in some of the meetings, but as I mentioned before, we will not be in most of the meetings because there's too many of you, which is a good thing. So that's our schedule for our CVD. We're looking forward to it. And if we should be getting more information preparing you for all this over the next week. I am afraid to tell you that the cherry blossoms are peaking right now. So they'll probably still be around by the time you get here, but not in all their glory, I'm afraid. Sorry, timing wasn't perfect. You will be getting your Soapbox tool. As I mentioned, it will contain all of the information you need to have a successful CVD. All the documents, all the briefing papers, your team members' names, contact information, email addresses. By the way, I do encourage you to reach out to your teammates before Tuesday. Send them an email, introduce yourself, mention what you think the top priorities should be. Start getting yourselves on the same page before you get here. And then Tuesday, you can just bring it all together. Please do remember, if you need to cancel your participation, and if you got an invite for this meeting, then you are on our list to participate in the CVD. If you cannot attend, please let us know immediately. The meetings are being scheduled every day, and the sooner we can cancel your meetings, the less embarrassing it'll be for us. We also ask you to log into your digital tool, hopefully Wednesday, but certainly by this Friday, so that by the time we get to the weekend, we know precisely who is coming to our CVD and who is not. To be honest with you, every year there's a couple people who simply don't show up. And it's always a little embarrassing to cancel Hill meetings the day of the meeting. And we're trying to avoid that as much as possible. And with that, we'll see you on April 4th. If you have any questions, if things come up, if you think of things between now and the 4th, feel free to reach out anytime. You have my email, you have my phone number. Please contact me with any questions. One question, a good question I got just yesterday. I made the statement on our last training session that we won't be using name tags on Capitol Hill because they make you look like a tourist, which is not what we want. You will, however, be receiving IEEE-USA lapel pins to add to your suit to identify you as part of the IEEE team. So we will have pins to identify you, just not name tags. And with that, I do not see any comment. Oh, I see a couple questions. Yes, all of the slides will be sent to you shortly after this call. I need to send you actually the slides from our last session as well. This presentation is being recorded and it will be on our website. Our tech guys, Greg Hill and Jonathan Cho, are usually really good about getting them up quickly. I don't want to say it'll be the end of the day, but it'll probably be the end of the day, and if not, first thing tomorrow morning. So you will have access to all of this moving forward. Another question. Craig, it depends on exactly what you're asking for. You are not a lobbyist. When I go in to talk to congressmen about the budget, I need to know exactly the line number, exactly the dollar, what agency, which of the appropriations bills, all that stuff I need to know. You don't. If there's a particular program you think is worthy of funding, simply saying, I think you should fund this, is really all you need to do. If you have a particular dollar amount in mind, saying, I think you should fund this at least this level, that's fantastic. But all you really need to know is mention the program and saying, I think this is important. Let the staff go find it. Or the staff can ask me to go find it and I'll find it for them. But you don't necessarily have to do that. Now, Craig, if you would like more information on a particular budget program, send me a quick email. I can track it down for you, probably. But you don't want to get too much into the weeds in these meetings unless this is absolutely essential to you, in which case this is what you want to build your meeting around. Then there you go. That's what you should do. Frederico asked about business cards. 5 years ago, I'd say business cards are essential because it's how people in Washington keep track of who they met with. COVID changed that. It's not quite as essential. If you have business cards or want to go through the process of making business cards, you get the Avery business cards. Those work. Doesn't have to be too technical. Just put your name, IEEE, your address. You got to have your address. That's how the legislators know where you vote. Your cell phone number if you want it, or maybe just your email, and just something to contact you on it, to hand to the staffer that's helpful. It gives the staffer a way of getting in contact with you if they have questions. And since you guys know stuff about a lot of these policy areas, there is a chance the staff will want to reach out to you and ask you questions about them. And you need to give them a way to do that. However, if you don't have business cards, you're retired or you're a student, that's okay. Here's what you do. Get business cards from everybody you meet with. And usually there'll be a little tray on the receptionist desk that is not staffed by a receptionist, because they don't have receptionists anymore on Capitol Hill. It's staffed by one of the policy people, and they kind of rotate. But the desk is still there. And there's a little tray that has everybody's business card. When you first get to the room, there is absolutely nothing wrong with you looking through those cards and pulling the card for the staffer you're going to meet with. Don't grab them all, just the people you're going to meet with. It is also entirely appropriate to ask for a card in all your meetings, and you definitely should do that. So at the end of the day, you get a bunch of cards from all the people you met with. Send them all a quick thank you note. Hey, I met with you today with the IEEE group. We talked about these two things. I just wanted to thank you for your time and say I'm looking forward to working with you down the road. And in the email, include your address. They have your email, your cell phone if you're comfortable giving that out. So the goal is somehow you have to get the staff your contact information so they can get in touch with you if they want to. It'll help them remember who you are and give them a way of reaching out to you if they want to do so. Business cards makes that easy. An email is effective as well if you prefer. But you got to do one of the two of them because you want to talk to them again down the line. Okay. I don't see any other questions. Like I said, this session is being recorded and will be available shortly. I am always available to you And if you don't have any more questions, I will talk to all of you again on April 4th at 1 o'clock at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for volunteering for the CVD. This should be a fantastically fun event. The weather looks like it's going to be great for us next week, and we should all have a lot of fun on Capitol Hill. Thanks. Have a great afternoon.